The string quartet was playing something soft and forgettable when Admiral James Harlan stopped walking. He had just entered the ballroom. Dress whites, for stars, the kind of presence that makes a room reorganize itself without anyone deciding to. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Richard's guests, most of them naval officers or their wives, straightened almost involuntarily. This was the man Richard had spoken about for 20 years. The man whose photograph sat framed on Richard's desk longer than our wedding portrait did. Harlan didn't stop to greet the host. He walked past the head table, past the champagne display, past Richard, who was already moving forward with his hand extended and his best smile ready. He walked to table 12, the one nearest the kitchen, the one nobody chooses. He stopped in front of me, and in a ballroom full of people who had watched me arrive alone, sit alone, and eat my bread roll alone, Admiral James Harlan bowed his head and said, "Vice Admiral Lawson, I didn't know you'd be here tonight." The quartet stopped. I don't think anyone told them to. I wish I could tell you the moment felt the way I'd always imagined it would. Clean. Certain. Some quiet version of justice arriving exactly on time. But standing there in my navy blouse and the pearl earrings Claire had given me for Christmas, all I felt was the strange, disorienting weight of being seen. After so many years of being the woman in the background of Richard's life, being seen felt almost violent. That morning, I had sat at my kitchen table in Annapolis for 40 minutes without moving. The invitation was still in its envelope. Cream paper, Richard's handwriting on the front, always precise, always controlled. Inside, in the same hand, "Hope you can make it, Eleanor." 4 words. No comma after "make it." I noticed that. I notice things like that now. I made coffee I didn't drink. I called Claire and hung up before it rang. I walked to the window and watched the neighbor's dog bark at something in the hedges. Then I went upstairs and put on the navy blouse. Not because I had something to prove. I told myself that the whole drive down to Chesapeake Beach. "You have nothing to prove." I said it out loud twice, somewhere on Route 50, with the windows down and the bay just visible through the tree line. I almost believed it. That was the morning I understood something I hadn't let myself think clearly in years, that the hardest rooms to walk into aren't the ones where people hate you. They're the ones where people have already decided who you are. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I had just gotten back from the farmer's market on West Street, the one I go to every week now. The one I started going to the year after the divorce when I needed somewhere to be on Saturday mornings and then somehow kept going on Tuesdays too. I had a paper bag of tomatoes in one arm and my keys in my hand when I saw it in the mailbox. Cream envelope. No return address. But I knew the handwriting before I even touched it. Richard has the kind of handwriting they don't teach anymore. Precise. Slightly backward-leaning. Every letter exactly the same height as the one before it. 23 years of seeing that handwriting on grocery lists, birthday cards, legal documents. You don't forget it. I set the tomatoes on the porch steps and opened it standing up. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the marriage of Richard Allen Lawson and Stephanie Marie Coulter, the Chesapeake Naval Officers Club. Saturday, the 14th of September. Reception to follow." And then below the printed text in his own hand, "Hope you can make it, Eleanor." I read it 3 times. The first time I felt nothing. The second time I felt something I didn't have a name for. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something older than both. The third time, I understood exactly what the invitation was. It wasn't courtesy. Richard had never done anything without a reason in his life. This was a door being held open so I could walk through it and be reminded of everything I no longer had access to. The Chesapeake Naval Officers Club. Richard had taken me there exactly once, early in our marriage, for a colleague's retirement dinner. I had worn the wrong dress. "Too casual," he said in the car on the way home. Not a criticism, just an observation. He was always just making observations. I went inside and put the invitation on the kitchen counter. It stayed there for 11 days. I had met Richard in 1987 at a hospital in Norfolk, Virginia. He was a lieutenant commander with a hairline fracture in his left wrist and the particular confidence of a man who has never had to explain himself to anyone. I was 26. I thought his certainty was strength. It took me a long time to understand the difference. We were married for 18 years. In that time, I worked as a surgical nurse at Portsmouth Naval Medical Center, raised Claire mostly alone through 3 deployments, and learned to make myself smaller in rooms where Richard needed to be the largest thing present. I was good at it. That's the part one don't say out loud often. I was genuinely good at disappearing. On the 11th day, I picked up the invitation again. I read the handwritten line one more time. Hope you can make it. I thought about the dress code. I thought about walking in alone. I thought about the exact expression Richard would have on his face when he saw me. That particular smile, the one that said I knew you'd come and isn't that just like you at the same time. Then I thought about something Claire had said to me 4 years ago on the phone from her apartment in Seattle. Mom, you always look like you're waiting for someone's permission. I folded the invitation back into the envelope. Set it on the counter again. But this time I left it face up. People who met Richard at parties liked him immediately. That was the thing about him. He had a way of making a room feel like it had been waiting for him to arrive. He remembered names. He asked follow-up questions. He laughed at the right moments and went quiet at the right moments and somehow always ended up at the center of whatever conversation he walked into, without anyone being able to say exactly how it happened. I used to watch him work a room and feel something that took me years to identify. It wasn't admiration. It was loneliness. Because the man I watched at parties was never quite the man who came home. Richard had joined the Navy at 22 with the kind of certainty that some men are simply born with and others spend their whole lives performing. By the time I met him, he was already a lieutenant commander. By the time Claire was in middle school, he was a captain. He wore his rank the way some men wear their faith, quietly, constantly, as the organizing principle of everything. His world had a clear order to it. Flag officers at the top, commissioned officers below, enlisted personnel below that, civilians somewhere further down, useful in their place but not quite part of the same conversation. I was a nurse. I was a civilian. I was, in the geography of Richard's world, somewhere near the bottom of a hierarchy he never had to state out loud because he never had to. It was simply understood. He never called me stupid. I want to be precise about that. Richard Lawson was far too intelligent to say anything that could be repeated later. What he did instead was smaller and more consistent. He corrected me in front of people. Gently, always gently, with the patience of a man explaining something to someone who almost understood. He answered questions that had been directed at me. He summarized what I had just said, slightly differently, and the conversation would continue in his direction. At dinner parties, if I started a story, he would finish it. Not rudely, just efficiently, the way you'd complete a sentence for someone who was searching for the right word. After a while, I stopped starting stories. The divorce was his idea, which surprised me less than it probably should have. Claire was 20 home from her second year at Georgetown when Richard sat down at the kitchen table one evening and told me he thought we had run our course. He used that phrase exactly. Run our course. Like we were a program that had completed its function. He was not unkind about it. He had consulted a lawyer before the conversation, had the paperwork already prepared, had thought through the financial arrangements with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to everything. He was, as always, efficient. I signed the papers 6 weeks later in a conference room in downtown Annapolis with a mediator and a view of the parking garage across the street. Walking out, Richard held the door open for me. Old habit. On the sidewalk, before we went to our separate cars, he looked at me with something that might have been genuine. Not cruelty, not relief, just the flat assessment of a man closing an account. You were never really cut out for this world, Eleanor, he said. I think you always knew that. I didn't answer. I had stopped having answers for Richard a long time before that afternoon. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. Then I went inside and started a pot of soup and thought, for the first time in longer than I could remember, about what I actually wanted to do with the rest of my life. That thought, quiet, unannounced, arriving in a kitchen that suddenly felt entirely mine, turned out to be the most dangerous thing Richard ever accidentally gave me. I was 41 years old when I walked into the Navy recruiter's office in Annapolis. The petty officer behind the desk looked up, looked back down at his paperwork, then looked up again with the particular expression of someone recalibrating. I was wearing a rain jacket and carrying a canvas tote bag with a library book in it. I did not look like someone who was about to change the entire direction of her life. "Can I help you?" he said. "I'd like to discuss officer candidacy," I said. "I have a master's degree in nursing and 14 years of surgical experience at Portsmouth Naval Medical Center." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Let me get you some forms. I want to be honest about why I did it. It was not because of Richard. I know that's the cleaner story. The ex-wife who joins the Navy to prove something to the man who dismissed her. I understand why people assume that. But the truth is smaller and less satisfying and, I think, more real. It was because of what Claire said. She had called me on a Sunday evening in March, 2 years after the divorce. She was in her apartment in Seattle, just back from a run, still slightly out of breath. We were talking about nothing in particular, her job, a book she was reading, whether I had fixed the gutter above the back porch yet. And then, in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely, she said, "Mom, you always look like you're waiting for someone's permission." She said it the way you say something you've been thinking for a long time but weren't sure how to place. Not as an accusation. Just as an observation. I said, "That's not true." She was quiet in the way Claire gets quiet when she's being kind. I thought about that sentence for 6 months. The thing about spending 18 years making yourself smaller is that you don't notice it happening in real time. It's not a single decision. It's 1,000 small adjustments, each one reasonable on its own. You stop finishing your sentences because it's easier. You stop disagreeing in public because the aftermath isn't worth it. You start measuring your words before you say them, and then you start measuring your thoughts before they become words. And somewhere in that process something goes quiet inside you that was never supposed to go quiet. I had been a good nurse. I knew that. In the operating room, I was precise and fast and I didn't second-guess myself. That version of me, the one who existed between 7 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon at Portsmouth Naval Medical Center, was the only version I fully trusted anymore. The rest of the time I was waiting. Claire was right. I just hadn't let myself hear it until she said it out loud. Officer Candidate School was in Newport, Rhode Island. I arrived in January, which I later learned was considered by everyone who had been through it as the worst possible time to arrive. The cold came off Narragansett Bay in a way that felt personal. I was the oldest candidate in my cohort by 11 years. There were 23-year-olds in my unit who had never lived away from home. I had raised a child, buried my father, and renegotiated a mortgage by myself. We were not the same kind of nervous. I graduated 5th in my class. What followed were 12 years I don't know how to summarize quickly. Deployments to Bahrain, to Japan, to Djibouti. A posting at Bethesda that changed how I understood military medicine. A year in the Pentagon that changed how I understood everything else. Promotions that came not because I asked for them, but because the work was there and I did it, and apparently that was still, in some contexts, enough. I called Claire from every time zone. I missed 2 of her birthdays and made it to the rest. I learned to sleep in 4-hour increments and to make decisions with incomplete information and to be the calmest person in a room when the room needed someone to be calm. I became, without entirely planning to, someone I recognized. I never told Richard any of it. He had remarried within 2 years of our divorce. A woman named Patricia, then apparently Patricia hadn't worked out either, and now there was Stephanie. I knew these things the way you know things about weather in a city you used to live in. Distantly. Without it mattering much. He didn't know about Newport. He didn't know about Bahrain or Bethesda or the year in the Pentagon. He didn't know about the promotion that came through on a Tuesday morning while I was eating a bowl of rice in a forward operating base outside of Djibouti. He had decided who I was in a parking lot in Annapolis on a Wednesday afternoon. He just didn't know I had kept going after that. The strange thing about becoming someone new is that it doesn't feel like becoming. It feels like remembering. Like finding a room in a house you'd lived in for years that you somehow never opened. I arrived at the Chesapeake Naval Officers Club at 6:47, 13 minutes early, which is a habit I've never been able to break. In the Navy you are either early or you are late. There is no arriving on time is already late, and after 12 years that particular reflex has become permanent. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 11 of those 13 minutes. The club sat on a low hill overlooking the bay, white columns, lit from below, the kind of building that exists to remind you of its own importance. I had driven past it dozens of times over the years. I had been inside it exactly once. I was wearing the navy blouse. Civilian clothes. No insignia. Nothing that announced anything. I had decided that on the drive down. Not a performance. Not a reveal. Just a woman attending a wedding. If the evening was what I suspected it would be, I didn't need to bring anything with me. And if it wasn't, I didn't need to announce anything either. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror once. Then I got out of the car. Richard was standing near the entrance when I came through the door. He looked good. I noticed that the way you notice weather, factually, without it meaning anything. He was in a dark suit, silver at the temples now, the straight-backed posture that 20 years in the Navy makes permanent. Stephanie was beside him in ivory lace, young in the way that made the age difference visible without either of them seeming to notice. He saw me and something moved across his face. Quick, controlled, gone before anyone else would have caught it. Then the smile arrived. The one I knew. Eleanor. He stepped forward, kissed the air beside my cheek. You came. I did, I said. You look well. He said it the way he always said things, pleasantly, with the faint implication that well was slightly less than expected. He turned to the couple nearest him, a commander I didn't recognize and his wife, and said, with his hand briefly at my elbow, "This is Eleanor. My ex-wife. She was a nurse at Portsmouth for years. Was. Past tense. Unremarkable. Done." The commander smiled politely. His wife said it was lovely to meet me. The conversation moved on without me, the way conversations at these events always do, efficient as water finding its level. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray and went to find my table. Table 12 was near the kitchen, which meant I could hear the staff moving behind the door and smell the dinner before it arrived. There were 6 place cards at the table. By 7:15, 4 of the seats had filled with people who introduced themselves, made brief and pleasant conversation, and then turned to speak to each other. The seat to my left remained empty all evening. I didn't mind. I have sat alone in worse places than a wedding reception in Annapolis. I watched the room the way I'd learned to watch rooms. Not obviously, just with attention. Richard moved through his guests with the ease of a man in his natural habitat. Stephanie laughed at something near the bar, her hand on the arm of a woman I assumed was her mother. The naval officers clustered in the way they always do, a subtle gravitational pull toward rank, conversations organizing themselves by invisible hierarchy. I ate my bread roll. I drank half my champagne. I checked my phone once and put it away. At 7:40, the doors opened and Admiral James Harlan walked in. I had met Harlan twice before, briefly, in professional contexts. He was the kind of officer who made other officers conscious of their posture. 63 years old, third-generation Navy. The sort of record that gets mentioned in the same breath as words like distinguished and decorated and other words that have been used so many times they've worn smooth. Richard had spoken about him the way people speak about landmarks. As something fixed. As something that conferred meaning on whatever was near it. The room responded to his entrance the way rooms respond to that particular kind of authority. Not loudly, just a subtle reorganization, conversations pausing and restarting, people becoming slightly more aware of themselves. Richard was already moving toward him, hand extended, the best smile ready. I watched Harlan scan the room. It was a professional habit, the kind you develop after enough years of walking into spaces where you're responsible for everything in them. A quick, systematic read. Entrance, perimeter, faces. His eyes moved across the room. And stopped. I set down my champagne glass. Harlan said something brief to the man beside him, handed off his cover, and began walking. Not toward the head table. Not toward Richard, who had now reached the edge of the crowd and was waiting with his hand still half extended. Toward table 12. Toward the chair to my left. Toward me. I sat very still. 12 years of training, and I sat very still and thought, with remarkable clarity, do not let your face do anything yet. That was the moment I understood what the evening was actually going to be. Not what Richard had planned. Something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with Richard at all. Harlan pulled out the chair to my left and sat down. Not the chair across from me. Not the chair at a comfortable, conversational distance. The chair directly beside me, close enough that I could see the service ribbons on his chest and the particular stillness of a man who has spent decades in rooms where stillness is a form of authority. He set his cover on the table, folded his hands, and looked at me with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who has already decided this is where he intends to be. "Vice Admiral Lawson," he said. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." His voice was low. Not quiet low. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it has never needed volume. "Admiral Harlan," I said. "It's good to see you. How do you know the groom?" Feet. I was married to him." Harlan looked at me for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like a piece of information finding its correct place in a larger picture. "I see," he said. And then, without any particular inflection, he didn't mention that. I became aware of the room changing before I fully understood why. It happens that way sometimes. The body registers the shift before the mind catches up. A change in the quality of sound. Conversations not stopping but thinning. The way a crowd thins when something draws attention without announcing itself. The particular silence of people pretending not to watch while watching. I didn't turn around. Harlan was asking me about the 7th Fleet, a posting I'd completed 18 months earlier, a year off the coast of Japan that I still thought about more than almost anything else in my career. He asked specific questions, the kind that signal genuine familiarity with the work. I answered them. We talked about the medical infrastructure challenges in forward deployments, about a policy change I'd helped implement at Yokosuka Naval Base, about a young lieutenant commander whose work Harlan had apparently followed since. We talked for 11 minutes. I know because I checked my watch afterward, the way you check a watch after something that felt longer. For 11 minutes, Admiral James Harlan gave me his complete and undivided attention in a room full of people who had spent the evening giving me none. I heard Richard before I saw him. Not his voice, his footsteps. I know the way Richard walks, the particular rhythm of a man who moves through spaces as though they belong to him. I had heard those footsteps on hardwood floors and hospital corridors and the deck of a ship once, long ago, when we were still the kind of married people who did things together. He appeared at the edge of my peripheral vision and stopped. I did not turn my head. "Jim," he said. The casual use of the first name, practiced, slightly too casual. "I didn't realize you two knew each other." Harlan looked up from our conversation with the measured pace of a man who turns his attention away from things only when he decides to. "We've crossed paths professionally," Harlan said. The Vice Admiral ran the medical theater coordination for 7th Fleet. Exceptional work out of Yokosuka. The word Vice Admiral landed in the room like something dropped from a height. I watched it happen in the faces of the people nearest us. The commander whose wife had smiled politely at me 2 hours ago. The woman from Table 11 who had looked through me at the champagne display. A lieutenant colonel near the edge of the dance floor who straightened almost imperceptibly. Richard did not straighten. Richard went very still. I turned to look at him then. I hadn't planned to. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't a moment I had rehearsed. I simply turned, the way you turn toward something when you want to see it clearly. His face had the quality of a man doing rapid, silent arithmetic. The tuxedo. The practiced smile. The hand that was still slightly extended from when he'd approached, not quite lowered yet, hovering at a height that no longer made sense. Stephanie had come up beside him. She looked between us with the polite confusion of someone who has arrived in the middle of a conversation and is trying to locate the beginning. "Richard," I said. "Congratulations. It's a beautiful venue." He said something. I don't remember exactly what. Something appropriate, something correctly assembled. Richard has never in his life failed to produce the correct sentence for a social situation. But the sentence arrived a half-second late, and in that half-second I saw something I had never seen on Richard Lawson's face in 23 years of knowing him. I saw him not know what to do. Harlan excused himself 20 minutes later. Another table, another conversation, the natural movement of a man with many obligations. Before he stood, he shook my hand and said he hoped our paths would cross again professionally. He said it the way people say things they mean. After he left, I sat alone at table 12 for a while. The room had changed its relationship to me. I could feel it without looking. The way attention redistributes itself when information changes, the way people recalibrate. The commander's wife came over and introduced herself again. properly this time with both hands. Two officers I hadn't met stopped by the table. A woman named Barbara, who turned out to be Stephanie's aunt, sat down and asked me about Japan. I talked to Barbara for a long time. She had never been to Japan. She wanted to know everything. At 9:30 I got my coat from the cloakroom and said my goodbyes to the people nearest the door. Richard was across the room in conversation and looked up once. I raised my hand. Not a wave, just an acknowledgement. He nodded. That was the last time we looked directly at each other that evening. In the parking lot, the bay was dark and the air smelled like salt and approaching autumn. I sat in my car for a few minutes without starting the engine. The club windows were lit and I could hear, faintly, the quartet starting up again. I thought about the drive up that morning. The coffee I hadn't drunk. The invitation on the counter. Hope you can make it, Eleanor. I had made it. I wasn't entirely sure what I had made it to, or what any of it meant, or whether the quiet I felt sitting in that parking lot was peace or just exhaustion. Possibly both. In my experience, the two are harder to tell apart than people suggest. I started the engine. I drove north on Route 50 with the windows down and the bay invisible in the dark somewhere to my right, and I thought about Claire, and about Newport in January, and about a surgical suite in Portsmouth where a younger version of me had known, for a few hours every day, exactly who she was. The victory, I was beginning to understand, had not happened in the ballroom. It had happened 12 years ago in a recruiter's office in Annapolis, when a petty officer looked up from his desk and I told him what I had come to do. Everything else was just the long echo of that one decision. I was almost at the door when I heard him behind me. Eleanor. Not loud. Richard has never needed to be loud. Just my name in that particular register he used when he wanted something to stop. Not a request, not quite a command, something in between that I had spent 18 years responding to without entirely meaning to. I stopped. Old habit. I was already working on unlearning it. I turned around. He was standing in the corridor outside the main ballroom, far enough from the door that the music was muffled and the light was different, dimmer, institutional, the kind of light that doesn't flatter anyone. He had loosened his tie slightly. In 23 years, I had never seen Richard loosen his tie in public before 11 o'clock. He looked, for the first time that evening, like a man without a prepared sentence. We stood in the hallway for a moment without speaking. Down the corridor, a catering staff member pushed a cart of empty glasses past us without looking up. Somewhere behind the ballroom door, the quartet had moved into something slower. "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard said. It wasn't quite a question. It arrived without a question mark, the way statements arrive when the person saying them already suspects the answer and isn't sure they want to hear it confirmed. I looked at him. Tell you what, Richard. Any of it. A pause. The Navy. The rank. Any of it. I considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. Not to be cruel. Because it was, genuinely worth thinking about. You never asked, I said. Not once in 18 years. Not after either. He started to say something. Stopped. I assumed. I know what you assumed, I said. Not unkindly. Just precisely. You assumed I went back to nursing. Or didn't. You assumed I was more or less where you left me. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. I have sat in a lot of silences in my career. Silences in operating rooms, silences in forward operating bases, silences in Pentagon conference rooms where everyone is waiting for someone else to speak first. I know the difference between silence that is empty and silence that is doing work. This one was doing a great deal of work. I didn't think you'd. Richard stopped again. Restructured. I didn't know you were interested in that world. I know you didn't. You never said anything about Richard. I said his name quietly, without sharpness. I tried a few times. Early on. I mentioned the idea once, maybe twice. Do you remember what you said? He looked at me. You said it wasn't practical. That I was too established at Portsmouth. That starting over at my age in a new institution would mean giving up seniority and benefits, and I paused. You said it very reasonably. You had thought it through completely. You always had thought everything through completely. Something moved across his face. Not anger. Something more uncomfortable than anger. I was trying to. I know what you were trying to do, I said. I believe that. I believed it then too. That's what made it so effective. He looked away. Down the corridor, toward nothing in particular. Richard Lawson was 61 years old, and he had spent 4 decades being the most prepared person in every room he entered. He had contingency plans and fallback positions, and the particular confidence of a man who has never had to improvise. Watching him stand in that hallway without a prepared sentence was like watching a building discover it had been constructed on the wrong foundation. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I had imagined versions of this conversation over the years. Not obsessively, not often, but occasionally, the way you imagine conversations you know will never happen. In those versions I was sharper, more certain. I had better sentences. Standing there in the actual hallway, I mostly felt tired. And something else underneath the tired, something that took me a moment to identify. Compassion. Reluctant, unsentimental, genuine compassion. Because I could see it now, clearly, in a way I hadn't been able to see it from inside the marriage. Richard had not diminished me because he was cruel. He had diminished me because he was frightened. A man who needs to be the largest thing in a room is a man who does not trust what happens when he isn't. That fear had organized his entire life. It had organized mine too for 18 years, and I had let it, and that was my part of it, the part one had spent a long time learning to look at directly. I think, Richard said finally, still looking down the corridor, that I made you smaller than you were. The sentence arrived carefully, the way Richard always arrived at difficult things, slowly, correctly, a little too late. Yes, I said. You did. I'm Richard. I waited until he looked at me. It's your wedding night. Go back inside. He stood there for another moment. The tie still slightly loosened. The prepared sentences still not arriving. Outside, somewhere past the club's white columns, the bay was dark and the air was moving off the water. Then he nodded. Once. The way you nod when there is nothing left to say and you have finally understood that. He turned and walked back toward the ballroom door. I watched him go. The straight-backed posture. The measured stride. The door opened and the music came through briefly. Something with strings, something slower than the evening had started with, and then the door closed again and the corridor went quiet. I stood there alone for a moment. Then I got my coat. He had made me smaller than I was. And I had let him. Both of those things were true at the same time, and carrying both of them, without giving either one more weight than it deserved, was the work I had been doing for 12 years. I wasn't finished. But I was further along than I had been in that parking lot in Annapolis, signing papers with a view of a parking garage. Further along is enough. Further along is, most days, everything. I called Claire from the parking lot. Not from home. I wasn't ready to be home yet. I sat in my car with the engine running and the heat on low and the bay invisible somewhere beyond the tree line, and I called my daughter at 10:47 on a Saturday night without thinking about the time difference. She picked up on the second ring. Mom. Not surprised, not annoyed. Just present, the way Claire has always been present, as though she had been expecting the call and had simply been waiting for me to make it. How is it? Not a question. Claire does that, removes the question mark from things she already knows the shape of. She gets it from me, I think. Or I got it from her. After a certain point in a mother-daughter relationship, the origins of things become difficult to trace. Interesting, I said. A pause. Interesting good or interesting you're sitting in a parking lot at 11 o'clock. Both, I said. Possibly the same thing. I told her about the evening in the order it had happened. The arrival, the bread roll, table 12, Harlan walking through the door. I told it the way I tell most things, which is to say chronologically and without excessive editorializing, because I have found that the facts of most situations are dramatic enough without assistance. Claire listened without interrupting, which is one of her best qualities. She learned it, I think, from years of watching me not listen well enough. Children learn the thing you failed to teach them by watching you fail. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. So he introduced you as a nurse, she said. His ex-wife who was a nurse, yes. And then the Admiral came and sat next to you. Correct. And called you Vice Admiral in front of everyone. In front of a significant portion of the Chesapeake naval community, yes. Another pause. When Claire speaks after a pause like that, it is always worth waiting for. Mom, she said. Did you finally feel like you belong somewhere? I sat with that question for longer than the silence probably communicated. It wasn't the question I had expected. I had expected something more direct. Satisfaction, maybe, or a version of "I told you so" delivered with the particular warmth Claire uses for things she has been right about for a long time. I had expected her to be pleased on my behalf, which she was. I could hear it underneath everything. But that wasn't the question she asked. She asked if I had felt like I belonged somewhere. I thought about the 11 minutes with Harlan. The specific questions about Yokosuka. The way the conversation had moved between two people who understood the same things and didn't need to establish that they understood them. I thought about Barbara, Stephanie's aunt, leaning forward over the table asking about Japan with genuine curiosity, and the unexpected ease of that conversation. I thought about standing in the corridor with Richard and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, that I was exactly the right size for the space I was standing in. "I think so," I said. "I think maybe I did." "Good," Claire said. Simple. Certain. The way she says things when she has been waiting for them for years. We talked for another 40 minutes. About her job, about a trip she was planning to Portugal in the spring, about whether I was going to fix the gutter above the back porch before winter, or simply allow it to become a permanent feature of the house. Normal conversation. The kind that exists to remind you that life continues in all directions simultaneously, that the significant moments and the ordinary ones run alongside each other without either canceling the other out. Before we hung up, she said, "I'm proud of you, Mom. Not for tonight. For all of it." I didn't answer immediately. There is a particular difficulty in receiving that sentence from your child, a different difficulty than receiving it from anyone else, because your child has seen the parts of you that didn't deserve it and has decided to say it anyway. "Thank you, Claire," I said. "Drive safe." I sat for another few minutes after we hung up. The parking lot was mostly empty now, a few cars remaining near the entrance, the club windows still lit. I reached into my coat pocket. The invitation was still there. Cream paper, slightly soft at the corners from an evening in my pocket. I took it out and looked at it for a moment in the dim light from the dashboard. "Hope you can make it, Eleanor." I had made it. Not to the wedding. To the thing on the other side of the wedding. The thing I hadn't known was there when I'd stood at my kitchen window watching the neighbor's dog and decided, quietly and without fanfare, to put on the navy blouse and go. I placed the invitation back in my pocket. Carefully. Face up. Then I put the car in drive and headed north toward home. The strange thing about finally belonging somewhere is that it doesn't feel like arrival. It feels like recognition. Like the place was always there, and you were always capable of finding it, and all that was required was the willingness to keep going long enough to see it. Richard's email arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks later. I was at my kitchen table in Annapolis with coffee that was actually hot this time, reading through a policy brief that had followed me home from the Pentagon the week before. The bay was visible from the window, gray-green in the October light, the kind of morning that smells like the end of something. The subject line was blank. That alone told me something. Richard has never in his life sent an email without a subject line. He considers it unprofessional. The blank subject line was, for Richard, a significant departure. The email was 4 sentences. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about our conversation in the hallway. I'm sorry I never saw you. I don't expect a response." I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and went back to the policy brief and didn't think about it again until that evening, which was not entirely true but was what I told myself. I sat with those 4 sentences for 3 days. Not because I was angry. The anger, whatever there had been of it, had been leaving for a long time. Not all at once, not dramatically, just steadily. The way water recedes after a flood, leaving the ground changed but navigable. I sat with the email because I wanted to answer it correctly, and correctly in this case did not mean efficiently or strategically or with the right tone. It meant honestly. And honesty, I have found, requires more time than most people give it. On the first day I thought about what Richard had taken from me. The years of making myself smaller. The sentences I hadn't finished. The story of my own life, told in his voice, in a register that left me out. On the second day I thought about what I had given him permission to take. That was the harder accounting. I had handed over things he hadn't even asked for, my opinions in rooms where I could have offered them, My ambitions in years when they were still possible to voice, my sense of my own scale. I had done it gradually, reasonably, one small adjustment at a time. Richard had accepted what I offered. That was his failure. Offering it was mine. On the third day I thought about Claire. About Portugal in the spring and the gutter above the back porch and 40 minutes on the phone in a parking lot in Annapolis. About a Sunday evening call from Seattle, a woman slightly out of breath, saying the truest thing anyone had said to me in years. You always look like you're waiting for someone's permission. I thought about that sentence. About how long I had waited. About what it had cost. About the recruiter's office in January in Newport in the cold and 12 years of deciding daily to keep going. And then I thought, I do not want to carry Richard Lawson's failure alongside my own anymore. I have enough to carry. We all do. I opened my laptop and wrote back. The email took 4 minutes to write and I did not revise it. Richard, thank you for saying so. I hope the marriage is a good one. Take care of yourself. I read it once. Then I sent it. That evening I took the invitation out of my coat pocket. I had left it there since the night of the wedding, had felt it every time I reached for my keys, had not moved it deliberately, and I held it for a moment. Cream paper, soft at the corners, hope you can make it in blue ink. I placed it in the drawer of my kitchen desk. Not in the trash. Not on the counter. In the drawer, with the other things I keep, Claire's first letter from Georgetown, a photograph of Narragansett Bay in winter, a coin from Yokosuka that a lieutenant commander had pressed into my hand on my last day there, and said, "Don't forget this one, ma'am." Things that had cost something. Things that had been worth it. I closed the drawer. I poured the last of the coffee, still warm, still mine, and stood at the window and watched the bay go dark in the October evening, and I did not wait for anyone's permission to feel, quietly and without ceremony, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Forgiveness is not a gift you give the person who hurt you. It is a weight you put down so you can walk more easily. Richard did not need my forgiveness. I did. That is the thing about forgiveness that nobody tells you. It was never really about them at all. So, back to that ballroom. Back to table 12, and the string quartet forgetting to play, and Admiral James Harlan walking past Richard Lawson with his hand still half extended and his best smile still waiting. I have thought about that moment many times since September. Not obsessively, just the way you return to certain rooms in your memory, because the light in them was different from other rooms, because something about the quality of the air told you that you were in the middle of something that mattered. People who heard about the evening afterward assumed the moment that mattered was the bow. The Vice Admiral. The silence spreading outward from table 12 like a stone dropped in still water. They weren't wrong. But they weren't entirely right either. The moment that actually changed something was 12 years earlier. A Tuesday morning in January. A recruiter's office on Compromise Street in Annapolis, a petty officer looking up from his desk, and a 41-year-old woman in a rain jacket setting down her canvas tote bag and saying, clearly and without apology, what she had come to say. Everything in that ballroom, the bow, the silence, the 11 minutes with Harlan, Richard's face doing its rapid and silent arithmetic, was just the long echo of that one Tuesday morning. The victory was never about Richard. It was never about being seen by the right people in the right room. It was about the morning I stopped waiting for someone to tell me I was allowed. If this story found you at the right moment, if you have spent years being seen as less than you are, defined by someone else's version of who you were supposed to be, I hope it reminded you of something. You don't need anyone's permission to know your own worth. Not then. Not now. Share this with someone who might need that reminder tonight.